It was a bright Monday morning, the kind of morning when the air feels fresh and the streets look calmer than usual. The sun was still low in the sky, spreading soft light over the small suburban town. People were on their way to work, the traffic light but steady. Among the cars rolling through the main road was a black SUV, clean and quiet, driven by a woman who looked focused, her hand steady on the wheel. She wasn't rushing, just moving with purpose. 2 police officers were parked near the side of the road, sipping coffee from paper cups. They had been there for nearly an hour, watching traffic, looking for small violations, seatbelts, speed, expired stickers, that kind of thing. It was part of their daily routine, something they did without much thought. One of them noticed the SUV coming down the street and said, "She didn't signal before that turn." The other nodded slightly and flipped on the lights. They pulled out onto the road, siren briefly flashing, and the SUV slowed to a stop near the curb. Inside the car, the woman sighed quietly. She glanced in the rearview mirror, saw the red and blue lights, and took a deep breath. She had done nothing wrong, she knew that. But she also knew how these moments could feel. She reached for her purse calmly, pulled out her license and registration, and waited with her hands visible on the wheel. Her expression stayed neutral, her body still. She had learned long ago that calm was her best armor. The 2 officers stepped out of their patrol car. One was in his late 30s, tall and fit, with the kind of posture that said he took his job seriously. The other was younger, a bit new to the force, and looked unsure of how to carry himself. They approached the SUV from both sides, one slightly behind the other. The older officer leaned toward the driver's window. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Do you know why we stopped you?" She looked up at him with polite curiosity. "I believe I used my signal," she said gently. He frowned a little, not expecting her tone to be so calm. "Maybe, maybe not," he replied. "We'll just check your info and make sure everything's in order." "License and registration, please." She handed them over immediately. "Of course," she said. "Everything should be current." He looked at the documents and glanced at her name, but it didn't ring any bells. "Where are you headed this morning?" he asked. "Work," she answered. "What kind of work?" His tone had a hint of challenge, like he didn't quite believe she had anything important to get to. She smiled faintly. "I work with the police department," she said simply. That made the younger officer glance over in surprise, but the older one looked unconvinced. "Which department?" he asked, sounding skeptical. She didn't flinch. "You'll see soon enough," she said in a calm voice that made him pause for a second. There was no sarcasm, no attitude, just quiet confidence. He nodded slowly, handed the papers to his partner, and stepped back to run her info through the computer. Everything came back clean. No violations, no warrants, nothing suspicious, just a woman driving to work. He felt a flicker of awkwardness, but pride made him hide it. He returned to the window. "All right, ma'am," he said. "Everything checks out. Just remember to signal next time." She nodded politely. "Of course." "Thank you, officer." He gave a short nod and walked back to his car. The younger officer hesitated, looking at her one last time before following. Something about her poise made him uneasy. It wasn't defiance, it was more like quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to speak loudly to be heard. As the patrol car pulled away, she sat for a few seconds before starting her engine again. Her face was calm, but her mind wasn't still. She had seen this before many times in different forms. The small ways people judged before they knew who you were. It wasn't anger that filled her, it was something softer, something tired. But she brushed it off, started the car, and drove toward the station. It was her first day on the job, and she wouldn't let a moment like that shake her focus. The drive to the police station wasn't long. The town was small and the roads were familiar. When she arrived, several cars were already parked out front. She looked at the building for a second. The brick walls, the glass doors, the blue emblem near the entrance. It all looked ordinary, but to her this was a new beginning. She stepped out, adjusted her jacket, and walked in. Inside, the station buzzed with low chatter. Officers were gathering for the morning meeting. It was a big day for everyone. Word had spread that a new chief of police would be introduced. Some were curious, some anxious. The department hadn't had new leadership in years, and many were wondering who the city had chosen. Most expected someone older, maybe from the same region, someone they already knew. The woman walked through the hallway quietly, nodding to a few staff members who didn't yet know who she was. She entered a small office to drop off her things, straightened her uniform, and took a moment to collect herself. This was the role she had worked her entire life for, a position that carried both power and pressure. She had served in multiple cities, led difficult reforms, faced public scrutiny, and earned her reputation through integrity and patience. Now she was here, ready to start again. Meanwhile, in the main room, the two officers who had pulled her over earlier arrived for roll call. They stood at the back, chatting lightly with others. "I heard the new chief's from out of state," one said. "Probably some big city type trying to fix us up." The other laughed. "As long as they don't make our lives harder." The mayor soon entered, shaking hands and greeting people. "All right, everyone," he said, clapping his hands to get attention. "I know you're all eager to meet your new chief. She's a highly respected officer with more than 20 years of experience in law enforcement. She's known for fairness, strength, and community leadership. I think you'll be proud to have her here." The officers straightened, whispering quietly to each other. The mayor gestured toward the door. "Please welcome your new chief of police." The door opened. Every head turned, and there she was, the same woman they had pulled over just hours earlier. She stepped inside wearing her new uniform, her badge shining under the lights. The room fell silent. The younger officer's mouth opened slightly in shock. The older one blinked hard, his face flushing. She walked forward calmly, shaking hands with the mayor, then turned toward the team. Her posture was straight, her expression composed. She looked around the room, taking in every face. She didn't look angry. If anything, she looked understanding, but her eyes held a quiet power that made even the most seasoned officers stand a little taller. The mayor finished the introduction, and the room filled with light applause. She nodded in acknowledgement, then began to speak. Her voice was calm but strong, carrying clearly across the room. She thanked the mayor, the department, and everyone for welcoming her. She talked about teamwork, respect, and trust. Every word felt genuine. Even those who didn't know her could feel it. She wasn't here just for the title. She was here to make a difference. As she spoke, her gaze moved across the faces in the crowd, resting briefly on the two officers from that morning. They froze, realizing she knew exactly who they were, but instead of calling them out, she simply gave a small, knowing smile, then continued speaking. She said, "What we do in uniform matters, but how we treat people when no one's watching matters even more." Her tone was steady, not sharp, but those words hit deep. Some officers nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew she was right. The meeting continued for a while longer, but the atmosphere had changed. The two officers felt the weight of the morning settle in. They replayed the stop in their minds, the tone they used, the way they assumed she was just another driver. Now, realizing who she really was, they felt a mixture of embarrassment and respect. They hadn't been cruel or rude, but they had been dismissive. And that, they realized, said enough. When the meeting ended, everyone filed out quietly, whispering to each other about the surprise. The woman, now chief, stayed behind to speak with the mayor. The two officers hesitated near the door, wanting to disappear but also feeling they should apologize. They didn't yet have the courage, so they walked out, heads low, promising themselves they'd make it right later. Outside, the morning sun was higher now, shining on the police cars lined up in front of the station. The day felt different, heavier maybe, but also full of possibility. Inside the building, the new chief looked out through her office window, watching her officers go about their routines. She knew change wouldn't come overnight, but she also knew something had already begun, quietly, in the hearts of the people who had seen her not just as a woman, not just as an officer, but as a lesson in humility. She smiled faintly to herself, took off her jacket, and sat down at her desk. Her first day had already taught the department something powerful, without a single lecture, without a single reprimand. Just a moment of truth, seen through the simplest of encounters. And somewhere in that small town, the story of that traffic stop would soon begin to spread, not as gossip, but as the start of something real. The morning meeting had ended, but the air in the station still felt heavy with surprise. Officers moved around quietly, pretending to get back to work, but most of them were still whispering about the same thing. The new chief, the woman they had just met, the one who carried herself with the kind of calm confidence that made everyone straighten their posture a little. Some were impressed. Some were curious. And some weren't sure what to think yet. Change always made people uneasy, especially in a place where things had been done the same way for years. The two officers from that morning sat in the break room, their coffee untouched. The younger one kept glancing at the door, nervous that she might walk in any second. The older one just stared at his cup, lost in thought. "I can't believe that was her," the younger one said finally, shaking his head. The older officer sighed. "Yeah, first day on the job, and we're the ones who stopped her." He let out a low chuckle, but it wasn't a happy one. "Guess that's what happens when you think you've seen it all." They both went quiet again. The younger one spoke after a moment. "Do you think she's mad?" "I don't know," the older man said honestly. "If she is, she's got every right to be." But she didn't look mad. She looked in control. The truth was, she didn't need to say a single word to make her point. Her calmness in that meeting had done more than any speech could. Every officer in that room had felt it. The silent reminder that respect shouldn't depend on rank, color, or who you think someone is. Upstairs, in her new office, the chief sat quietly at her desk. She had already unpacked her few personal items, a framed photo of her family, a small potted plant, and a leather notebook filled with notes from her previous departments. She looked around the room, studying the walls, the furniture, the small details. It wasn't a fancy office, but it was hers now. A place where she could make real changes. Her phone buzzed with a message from the mayor. "Welcome again. The staff meeting went great. Let me know if you need anything." She smiled faintly, then put the phone aside. She didn't need much. What she needed was time, to earn the trust of her officers, to show them that leadership was about listening, not just giving orders. She stood and walked to the window. From there, she could see the parking lot where the patrol cars lined up. Officers came and went, some laughing, some serious, each one carrying the weight of a job that demanded more than most people ever saw. She remembered being in their shoes, the long nights, the uncertainty, the moments of pride mixed with moments of doubt. She hadn't forgotten any of it. That was what made her determined to lead differently. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. "Come in," she said. A middle-aged man stepped in. It was the deputy chief. He smiled politely, a bit stiff. "Just wanted to officially welcome you," he said. "It's good to finally have you here." "Thank you," she replied warmly. "I'm looking forward to working together," he nodded. "There's a lot that needs attention here," he said carefully. "Morale, community complaints, old procedures. Some of the team might resist at first. It's been a long time since we've had new leadership." "I understand," she said. "Change isn't easy for anyone. But we'll get there." The deputy studied her for a moment, then smiled. "You handled the meeting well this morning. You had their attention." "I could feel that," she said quietly. "Sometimes silence says more than applause." He nodded in agreement. "Well, if you need help navigating the politics of this place, I'll do what I can." "I appreciate that," she said. "But for now, I just want to learn. I want to understand how things really work here." After he left, she opened her notebook and began writing. She listed out a few goals: community outreach, training updates, staff evaluations, and building trust inside the department. These were simple words on paper, but she knew they meant long, hard work ahead. Later that afternoon, she decided to walk through the station. No announcements, no special escort, just quietly moving from one department to another. She stopped by dispatch, chatted with the operators, thanked them for their work. She visited the records room, where two clerks looked surprised to see her but quickly smiled when she greeted them. She asked questions, listened to their challenges, took mental notes. By the time she reached the patrol area, the two officers from that morning were standing near their lockers. They noticed her immediately and froze for a moment. She didn't make a scene. She simply smiled politely and said, "Officers." "Chief," the older one said quickly, standing straighter. She nodded. "Busy day?" "Yes, ma'am," the younger one said nervously. "Just getting ready for afternoon patrol." "Good," she said. "Drive safe out there." Then she started to walk away but paused for a brief second. "You both handled yourselves professionally this morning," she said softly, not looking back. "Thank you for that." They exchanged a glance, unsure how to respond. Her words were kind, but the weight behind them was clear. When she disappeared down the hallway, the younger one whispered, "Did she just thank us?" "Yeah," the older one said. "She did. And I think that was her way of teaching us something. For the rest of the day, the department felt different. It wasn't about fear or tension. It was about awareness. Everyone seemed a little more careful, a little more thoughtful. Even small things like the tone officers used on the radio, or the way they spoke to civilians who came in to file reports, felt subtly changed. As the hours passed, the chief worked quietly in her office, reviewing old files, reading through past complaints, and taking notes on things that needed improvement. She didn't look for faults to punish. She looked for patterns to fix. She knew reform wasn't about making examples out of people. It was about rebuilding habits. By early evening, the station began to quiet down. Most officers had gone home. Only a few remained, finishing paperwork or preparing for night shifts. The chief stepped outside for a walk. The air was cooler now, the town quiet under the fading light. She walked past her SUV parked near the side of the building, the same car from that morning's encounter. She smiled faintly at the thought. Life had a strange way of setting the stage for lessons. As she walked toward the end of the parking lot, she noticed a young boy on a bicycle stopped near the station's entrance. He looked hesitant, maybe 10 or 11 years old. She walked over and smiled. "Hey there," she said kindly. "You okay?" The boy looked up, surprised. "Yeah," he said softly. "I just wanted to know if the police give tours." "My class is doing a project about jobs," she smiled. "Well, you're in luck," she said. "I think we can arrange something." His eyes lit up. "Really?" "Really," she said. "Come by with your teacher tomorrow. I'll make sure someone shows you around." He nodded eagerly and rode off, shouting a cheerful thank you. She watched him go, feeling something warm inside. Moments like that reminded her why she'd taken this job. Not for authority or recognition, but for connection. When she returned inside, the two officers were leaving their shift. They saw her near the door and hesitated, then walked over. The older one spoke first. "Chief," he said, his voice steady but sincere, "about this morning, we just wanted to apologize. We didn't mean any disrespect." She looked at them for a moment, then smiled gently. "You were doing your job," she said. "But it's always good to reflect on how we do it. That's how we grow." The younger one nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. We'll remember that." She gave a small nod. "That's all I ask." They left feeling lighter than before. As they stepped into their patrol car, the younger one said quietly, "She's different." "You can just tell." The older man nodded. "Yeah," he said, "and I think she's exactly what this place needs." Inside her office, the chief turned off the lights and looked out at the station one last time before heading home. The town glowed faintly under the streetlights. She thought about the faces she'd met, the conversations she'd had, and the lessons already unfolding. Change had begun quietly, not through orders or force, but through understanding. She picked up her keys, locked her door, and walked out to her car. The same road that had brought her an unexpected stop that morning now felt like a symbol of something new, proof that life has a way of teaching even when you least expect it. And as she drove home, under the dim orange sky, she smiled to herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new doubts, and new opportunities. But for the first time in a long while, this town had a chief who believed that the smallest encounters could change everything. The next morning came quietly, with the sky painted in soft shades of orange and gray. The chief arrived early, before most of the staff. She liked the stillness of the building at that hour, the sound of her footsteps echoing down the hallway, the hum of coffee machines starting up, and the smell of paper and polished floors. It reminded her of the calm before a storm, except this storm wasn't something to fear. It was change, and she was ready for it. She sat at her desk reading through reports. Old files, incident logs, community feedback, everything that told the story of how this department had been working. Some parts made her smile, others made her sigh. She wasn't looking for mistakes to punish, but for patterns to understand. If she was going to lead this team, she needed to see the full picture. Around 8, the deputy chief knocked on her door. "Morning, Chief," he said. "You asked for a staff meeting today?" "Yes," she said, closing the folder she'd been reading. 10 o'clock. "I want everyone there, patrol, admin, dispatch, everyone who can spare the time." He nodded. "Word's already going around." "They're curious?" "I'm sure they are," she said with a small smile. "Let's give them something real to think about." By 10 o'clock, the conference room was filled. Officers in uniform lined the walls. a few standing near the back, others seated at the long wooden table. Some looked tired, others bored, but most looked expectant. Everyone had been talking about the new chief, how calm she seemed, how she handled herself with quiet authority. Some respected it. A few didn't understand it yet. She walked in without fanfare, a folder in her hand and a steady expression on her face. The room went still. She took her place at the front, thanked the deputy chief with a nod, and began to speak. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice calm but clear. "I appreciate you taking the time to be here." She paused, letting her words settle. No one spoke. "I've spent the last 24 hours learning about this department," she continued. "Reading reports, looking at numbers, but more importantly, watching people. Watching how we talk to each other, how we move, how we work. And I want to start by saying something simple. This is a good department. You have dedicated people here. You care about your jobs. I can see that." A few nods around the room. She kept her gaze steady. "But," she went on, her tone softening, "good isn't always enough. Not if the people outside these walls don't feel safe with us. Not if they don't feel respected when they see our badge. We wear this uniform to protect, not to intimidate. To serve, not to judge. And sometimes without meaning to, we forget that." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calmness made everyone listen closer. "I know that the work you do isn't easy," she said. "You see people at their worst. You deal with anger, fear, and pain every single day. It changes you, even when you don't notice it. But we can't let it harden us so much that we stop seeing people as human beings. That's where trust begins to die." The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when people are thinking more than they want to admit. She stepped closer to the table, resting her hands lightly on it. "I believe every encounter is a choice," she said. "A choice to calm or to escalate. A choice to judge or to understand. We make those choices in seconds, and they define who we are far more than our badges ever will." Her eyes moved around the room, landing briefly on the two officers from the first day. They felt the weight of her gaze, but also something unexpected. Understanding, not anger. "One of the hardest parts of this job," she said, "is realizing how much power we hold in ordinary moments. A simple traffic stop, a conversation on a sidewalk, a call to someone's home. These moments seem small, but they shape how people see all of us. They decide whether we are trusted or feared." She paused again, giving the room a moment to breathe. "When I joined the force years ago," she said softly, "I was taught that respect had to be earned. But over time I learned something else. It also has to be given first. People mirror what they feel. When we show calm, they feel calm. When we show respect, they start to believe they deserve it. And when we lose our patience, they lose their faith in us." She walked slowly as she spoke, not pacing out of habit but moving naturally, like she was having a conversation rather than giving a lecture. "I'm not here to change who you are," she said. "I'm here to remind you who you were when you first put on this uniform. That feeling of purpose, that belief that you could make a difference. I want to bring that back." A few people in the room nodded. One older officer crossed his arms but listened more intently now. The younger ones looked inspired, some even moved. She continued, her tone quiet but powerful. "We're going to do things differently here. We'll have open talks about what we can do better, not to point fingers but to learn. We'll have training that focuses on real-life situations, not just rules on paper. And we'll work with the community, not above them. They need to see our faces when things are calm, not just when things go wrong." The deputy chief watched her carefully, impressed by the balance in her tone. She wasn't demanding respect. She was earning it right there, word by word. She looked at her officers again. "Change starts small. It starts with how you speak to the person you pull over, how you talk to the mother calling about her son, how you handle the person who yells at you in anger. Every time you have a choice to make it worse or to make it better." Her words hung in the air. The silence after them wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful. Then she smiled faintly. "I know some of you might think I'm idealistic," she said, "that I don't understand what it's like out there. But I've been there. I've walked into homes where people didn't want me there. I've been yelled at, cursed at, and doubted. I've also seen what happens when one kind word turns a fight into a handshake. I've seen the difference one moment of patience can make." Her tone softened again. "So I ask for only one thing from you. When you put on your badge tomorrow, remember it's not just metal. It's a promise. A promise to protect and to respect. And that promise starts with how we see people and how we see ourselves. For a moment, no one said a word. Then the room began to fill with quiet nods, small smiles, and something else. Understanding. Not everyone would agree right away, but they had heard her. They had felt something real. The meeting ended, but no one rushed out. Officers lingered, talking quietly, their voices lower, their expressions thoughtful. The two officers from her first day looked at each other, both knowing they had learned something more than just a lesson in protocol. As the crowd thinned, one of them approached her. "Chief," he said, clearing his throat, "that was something we needed to hear." She smiled kindly. "Thank you," she said. "It's only the beginning," he nodded. "You really believe we can change things here?" "I don't just believe it," she said. "I've seen it happen. But it takes everyone, not just one person at the top." He nodded again and walked away, feeling strangely hopeful. When the room finally emptied, she stood alone for a moment, looking out the window. The sun had risen higher now, casting light across the small town beyond. People were walking on sidewalks, cars moving through quiet streets. Ordinary life, the kind she'd sworn to protect. She thought about how her words might ripple through the department in the coming days. She knew not everyone would agree right away. Some would resist, others would test her resolve. But that didn't bother her. True change didn't happen overnight. It started like this, with a single conversation, a single moment of truth. As she left the room, she saw a few officers greeting civilians in the lobby, their tone gentler, their words kinder. It was small, but it was something. She smiled, knowing it was a start. Walking back to her office, she felt calm, almost peaceful. She wasn't just leading a department. She was rebuilding a bridge between people and the power meant to protect them. And deep down, she hoped that one day, no one would ever look at her the way those officers did that first morning. Not because she had earned a title, but because the badge itself would stand for respect, fairness, and humanity once again. The journey had only begun, but for the first time, the town felt like it was heading toward something better. It was late afternoon when Chief Daniels walked into her office after a long day of meetings. The sun was setting, its orange light spilling through the blinds, painting lines across her desk. She placed her folder down and took a deep breath. It had been a full day of introductions, paperwork, and conversations about the department's future. But one thing still rested on her mind, the two officers from that morning. She had decided she wouldn't ignore it. Not out of anger or pride, but because this moment could mean something more, for them and for her entire department. So she picked up her phone, called the front desk, and asked them to send the two officers to her office when they were free. About 15 minutes later, there was a quiet knock at her door. "Come in," she said softly. The door opened slowly. Both officers stepped in, looking uncertain. One of them cleared his throat. "You wanted to see us, Chief?" "Yes," she replied with a calm smile. "Please have a seat." They sat down across from her desk, their hands resting awkwardly on their knees. The air in the room felt tense, though she didn't raise her voice or frown. She simply studied them for a moment, her eyes steady but kind. "I wanted to talk about what happened this morning," she began. The officers exchanged a quick glance, their faces slightly red. One of them shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we're really sorry about that," he said quickly. "We didn't mean any disrespect. We were just doing our job." "I know," she said, cutting him off gently. "And I appreciate that." They both looked at her, surprised. "I'm not here to scold you," she continued. "You did what you thought was right at the time. But I want to use this as a learning moment and for all of us." The room went quiet again. The sound of distant voices in the hallway drifted through the door, but inside it felt like time had slowed down. "When you stopped me," she said slowly, "how did you see me?" The younger officer frowned slightly. "I guess, just a driver. A person who might have broken a traffic rule." "Nothing wrong with that," she nodded. "But was there anything else you noticed? Anything that made you assume something about me?" The other officer hesitated. He looked down at his shoes for a moment before answering. "I guess, maybe we thought you seemed a little too calm. And maybe we assumed you were trying to avoid answering questions." Chief Daniels nodded again. "That's honest, and I appreciate it." She leaned forward slightly, her voice still gentle. "I've been in this profession for 20 years. I've worn this uniform longer than some of you have been on the force. But I've also been on the other side of that window. Pulled over, questioned, doubted. Even when I was doing nothing wrong. The officers stayed quiet, listening carefully. When I told you I was on my way to work, she said, you asked what kind of work. That was a fair question, but there was something in your tone, something that told me you didn't expect my answer to matter. She paused, letting the words sink in. And now here we are. Neither officer spoke. One finally said, Chief, we didn't mean to disrespect you. Honestly, we had no idea who you were. We just thought, she raised a hand lightly. I know. And I don't want you to treat people differently because of who they are, or what position they hold. I want you to treat everyone with respect, period. Because when you do that, you'll never have to worry about who's watching. Her tone was calm, not harsh. It wasn't about punishment. It was about growth. She leaned back in her chair. I've seen good officers lose their way because they forgot what this badge means. It's not just about law and order. It's about service and humility. We have power, yes, but power means nothing if it isn't guided by empathy. The older officer nodded slowly. His expression had softened. You're right, Chief, he said quietly. We could have handled that better. I realize now how it might have come across, she smiled faintly. That's all I needed to hear. There was another short silence before she continued. I want both of you to help me with something. We're starting a new community outreach program, meeting with local residents, listening to their concerns, rebuilding trust. I'd like you two to be part of it. Both men looked surprised. Us? Yes, she said. You both had an experience today that most officers never get, to see firsthand how a small interaction can change how people feel about us. Use that. Let it teach you. They nodded quickly, their nerves easing a bit. Chief, the younger one said after a moment, can I ask something? When we stopped you, were you angry? She smiled thoughtfully. Honestly? For a moment, yes. But not because of you. Because it reminded me how much work we still have to do, and it reminded me why I'm here. Her voice softened even more. I've faced worse. People have said things, done things, tried to make me feel small. But I learned that staying calm is sometimes the strongest response you can give. That's what leadership is. Not reacting, but teaching through patience. The officers looked at her, both moved and humbled by her words. She stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Thank you for coming in. I know this wasn't easy, but I respect that you faced it. They stood as well. Thank you for giving us the chance, Chief, one said sincerely. Before they left, she added quietly, remember, every stop, every encounter, it's a moment that defines how people see us. Make sure it's one worth remembering. They nodded again, then walked out of the office, closing the door gently behind them. Chief Daniels sat back down and looked out the window. The sun had nearly set now, the golden light fading into soft gray. She felt tired but also hopeful. She had seen a spark of change, small but real. That evening, word quietly spread through the department that the new chief had met privately with two officers about a lesson learned. No one knew the full story, but they could feel something different about her, something strong yet compassionate. The two officers didn't brag about the meeting. They just went back to work, a little more thoughtful, a little more careful in how they spoke to people. One of them even mentioned later that night to a colleague, she didn't yell, she didn't lecture, she just made us think. That's worse than any punishment, in a good way. As the days went by, Chief Daniels continued to work long hours, meeting with city officials, planning reforms, and talking with officers one-on-one. Her goal wasn't just to manage the department, it was to change its heart. Every now and then she'd see those same two officers walking through the halls, nodding respectfully. Sometimes she'd catch them outside, greeting community members or helping drivers in small ways. And she'd smile quietly, knowing something had shifted. A few weeks later, during a morning briefing, one of them raised his hand and asked to speak. He told the group about his conversation with the chief, how embarrassed he'd felt that day and how it made him rethink everything about how he interacts with the public. The room went silent as he spoke, his voice steady but sincere. He ended by saying, "That morning changed me. I realized respect shouldn't depend on who we're talking to. It should be automatic, because one day that person you're judging could be your leader, or your lesson." The other officers nodded quietly. Chief Daniels didn't say a word. She just looked around the room, proud of what was unfolding. After the meeting, she stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The city was waking up, cars passing, people heading to work. For a moment, she thought about that morning again. The flashing lights, the questions, the disbelief, and how it all led here. Sometimes, she thought, life has a way of testing you, right before you step into something new. And sometimes the lesson isn't just for you, it's for everyone watching. She smiled to herself, adjusted her uniform, and walked back inside. She still had a lot to do, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like real change was possible. Weeks passed, and Chief Daniels slowly settled into her role as the new head of the department. Every morning she arrived early, coffee in hand, and greeted the officers with a calm smile. The air inside the building had started to change. The tension that once lingered in the halls was easing, replaced by quiet respect and curiosity. People were beginning to see her not just as their boss, but as someone who truly cared. Her leadership style was different. She didn't bark orders or make grand speeches every day. Instead, she listened to everyone. From senior officers to new recruits, she made time to ask about their experiences, their struggles, their hopes. Many had never been asked those things before. It was new, strange even, but it made them feel seen. Outside the station, the community began to notice changes too. Patrol cars drove slower through neighborhoods. Officers stopped to chat with locals instead of rushing past. There were small gestures, helping an elderly man cross the street, attending a kid's basketball game, joining cleanup drives on weekends. None of it made the news, but people noticed. Chief Daniels believed real change didn't need headlines. It needed hearts. One afternoon, she sat in her office reviewing reports when there was a knock on her door. It was one of the two officers she had spoken with weeks ago. He looked more confident now, but still carried a sense of humility in his posture. "Chief, do you have a minute?" he asked. "Of course," she said, putting her pen down. "Come in." He stepped inside and sat down. "I wanted to tell you something," he began. "Since that day, I've been thinking a lot. About how I talk to people, how I approach situations. I even apologized to a driver last week for how I came across during a stop. I didn't have to, but it felt right." She smiled gently. "That's growth," she said. "That's what leadership is, and not a rank, not a badge, but how you treat others when you don't have to." He nodded, a bit emotional. "I just wanted to thank you for giving us that chance instead of holding it against us." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression soft but serious. "You learned because you wanted to. I just opened the door. You walked through it." He smiled, stood up, and saluted lightly before leaving. When he closed the door, she sat for a while, thinking about how small actions could lead to deep change. That evening, she attended a community meeting at the town hall. Dozens of people were there, local residents, small business owners, even teenagers. The room buzzed with chatter and curiosity. This was the first time in years a police chief had come in person, not to speak at them, but to listen. As she stepped to the front, the room quieted. "Good evening," she said warmly. "I came here today not to make promises, but to build trust. One conversation at a time." Her voice carried both strength and calm. She didn't use fancy words. She talked about fairness, understanding, and respect. She admitted the department hadn't always gotten it right, but said they were working hard to make things better. "I want you to know," she said, "that behind every uniform is a person. And behind every person in this community, there's a story worth hearing." The crowd listened closely. For the first time, people felt like someone from the police force truly meant it. After the meeting, several residents came forward to shake her hand. A woman thanked her for stopping by her store the week before. A teenage boy said he was thinking about becoming an officer now because of her speech. When she finally left the hall that night, the sky was clear, the air cool and peaceful. She walked slowly to her car, feeling the weight of her badge, not as a symbol of power but of purpose. The following weeks brought even more positive change. The department launched mentorship programs where experienced officers guided new recruits. Chief Daniels encouraged them to share their personal experiences, even mistakes, to teach empathy and patience.